Hello, everyone, and welcome to Trauma Informed Conversations, a space created by the Trauma Informed Consultancy Services, also known as TICS, to explore what it really means to build systems and relationships grounded in care, connection, and humanity. I'm Carrie Wilson, the Collaboration and Innovation Lead here at TICS, and my work, like this podcast, sits where practice, research, and lived experience meet, creating spaces for honest reflection on how we understand trauma, how we respond to it, and how we build systems that can truly heal. This special episode is part of a new mini-series exploring trauma and healing, both within the care system and the spaces that surround it, where I invite beautiful, wonderful care experience people to lead on open, relational conversations about understanding change and what healing can look like. Hello, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Carrie Wilson, and today I'm joined by the lovely Lorna Stabler, Doctor now. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So yeah, I am technically doctor now, which is weird. So I'm Lorna. I am a researcher at Cascade Research Centre. So kind of do research focused on lots of things related to kind of care experience, but particularly around kinship care. So I am based at Cardiff University. I've lived in Cardiff for like 8 years now, and I'm originally from Newcastle, but via lots of places. I'm joining from the US at the minute. And I guess also relevant is I spent a lot of time, I grew up in and out of foster care and kinship care as a child, and then became a kinship foster carer for my little brother. So I kind of have that experience, I guess, from both sides. So a lot of that influences my research and the areas that I focus on. But yeah, like I'm also lots of other things as well, which maybe we'll talk about too.
Absolutely. And obviously your experience is important to why we're having this conversation today, which is around the topic of kinship care. So I guess for people that don't understand what kinship care is, could you give like a bit of a description for people?
Yeah, so I guess like in the broadest possible definition, kinship care is where someone who isn't a child's parent, but is kind of known to the child, kind of within their network, is kind of raising a child full time. So it could be kind of through a formal arrangement, so like a kinship foster carer, where a child is kind of legally looked after, so they're removed from their parent, they're placed with a foster carer, but that foster carer is, an older sister or an auntie or a family friend. They still go through an assessment process. But also kinship care can be, and more often is completely, an informal family arrangement where, people step in, when they need to, and take on the care of a child. So some of the examples I always like to give when I talk about kinship care is like, Spider-Man was in kinship care. He was brought up by his aunt and uncle. Batman was in kinship care. He was brought up by the butler, when his parents died. So it's that whole kind of umbrella term to mean, a child who's being raised kind of permanently, but like long term by someone kind of who is known to them but isn't their parent.
Thank you. And primarily, I guess that's that aspect of sibling kinship care. So previous to this podcast, we've had a lot of conversations about that. Your PhD research is about sibling foster care, and I have lived experience of that as well, being a sibling foster carer with you. So yeah, we're having that conversation today to dig down into what are the traumas around it, where can we be better supported, and how might we make changes, I guess, in this amazing, very impactful area that's often just not even made aware to the general public.
Yeah, so my PhD, so I've been in kind of social work research for like 10 years now. And before that, I did kind of some education research, but my PhD was the first time that I could just completely pick a topic. You can like choose exactly what it is that you think is kind of most interesting or important to research, rather than just working on someone else's project. So I think that idea of researching sibling kinship care really directly came from my lived experience, because I could see, actually, when I started my PhD, there was very little research just about kinship care in general. But the research that was there really focused on grandparents, and not just grandparents, but grandmothers, right? And a lot of the kind of research findings were focused on how hard it is to kind of get to the end of your life and you're thinking about retirement, and all of a sudden you've got, you know, a 3-year-old running around that you weren't expecting, or, you're having to go back to work to be able to afford to raise a child, or, like, or your health is failing and you're kind of looking after young children and how hard that is. And, I'd read that research and it was so just not relevant to
Yeah,
my experience.
but that didn't reflect either of our experiences, I don't think.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like there's this term kinship care that, like, technically my experience fit under, but how it was being described was nothing like kind of my experience or the things that I was concerned about.
Yeah.
But also a lot of the kind of research, kind of quote unquote research, was kind of done by charities that had a very specific narrative. So, like, there's kind of this idea that kinship carers are these heroes, kind of, who are stepping up and doing this, and that children have these wonderful outcomes when they're in kinship care compared to foster care, and the government just needs to do more to support them. And like, I had experience of being in kinship care as a child with my grandparents, and they were like really abusive. They were the people who had been abusive towards my mum, which led to a lot of her problems, which meant we went into care. So then we were put with those same people. So, like, in my mind, I was like, well, kinship care is so complicated. It's not this rosy story of, these hero grandparents. But
Mm.
also from my experience of being a kinship carer, like, I know I didn't do a perfect job. I was not the right person to be doing that. Like, I was just the easy option for social services. So, like, I just really wanted to dive into, like, not whether this is good or bad, or whether it's better than foster care or worse than foster care, but actually, like, what are people's kind of real lived experiences of going through that journey? And how does that feel? How does that feel for people? Like, and yeah, it was a real pleasure focusing on that in my PhD research.
Yeah, and I guess by doing that, you enable the space to just voice that too, because it sounds
Hmm.
like previous research actually, if anyone read it, they'd be like, oh, only grandparents kinship care. And, there's, I think, we've definitely talked about this before, where actually in those situations, obviously grandparents have had experience of parenting, whether that's good or bad, they have had that experience. And I think a key thing that I think both of us experienced was actually we hadn't had children before we chose or felt like it was the only option in that situation to support our sibling, um, without any prior experience of being parents. And I think very little guidance and support in that afterwards.
Yeah, and I think also, I know in my experience, and a lot of the people that I spoke to in my research, like, without much experience of being parented.
Ah, yeah,
So
yeah.
so not just not having experience of having been a parent yourself, but actually having limited or complicated or lacking experiences of having had a parent or not had a parent, and then you're having to kind of figure out, well, what makes a good parent? How does parenting work? I don't know. I've not seen it, or experienced it, and you're kind of on your own trying to figure that out. Often, I think, like, related to trauma, like,
Mm,
often coming into this space very traumatized yourself,
yeah.
trying to care for someone who's very traumatized. Often, like, my experience as well was like, I'd grown up through the care system, had a lot of issues and traumas that came from that, but then trying to look after my brother who had come through the system and was hugely traumatized by it, but also, like, trying to care for my mother
Mm,
who was also hugely traumatized based on her experience of, having been adopted and having had, experience of having a very abusive childhood. So you've got, like, three traumatized people trying to somehow navigate the world. And within, I was they call it formal foster care. foster carer. So I was like assessed by the local authority and given, like 100 quid a week or whatever, and some training to to
Involving
do this
trauma
role.
informed training.
I had to sit in a room with a bunch of foster carers, and they went around and asked, "So, what made you choose to be a foster carer?" And I'm like this 22-year-old in the corner, like, I didn't choose this. Um, yeah, I just, yeah, like, even like though I was in the like possibly most formal and supported route um to kinship care, like there was nothing. There was nothing that really actually helped me navigate like the complexities of the relationships and the trauma and just the practical stuff as well. Like, how do you help get a kid back into school when they're so anxious and traumatized by the school system? And yeah, it was,
Boundaries.
yeah,
That was also
100%.
with my brother of how do I set boundaries for like he's just traumatized behavior of, you know, he he took me setting boundaries as a bad thing because he never had boundaries with his dad. So then
Yeah,
took no boundaries as love. So if I try to put boundaries in, let's be home at a sensible time, that could
yeah,
sure. And there was no guidance in.
yeah. No. And there were so many people that I spoke to during my PhD research. So I interviewed 13 kind of sibling carers, and then I interviewed um three, well, yeah, three kind of young people who were raised by their siblings. Or there was three who were included. And then I also spoke with practitioners and kind of policymakers and people kind of within charities. And I think like so many, like even though everyone's story is completely different,
Mm.
so many people had the same kind of struggles because there was no guidance. But like I like you're talking about like boundaries, like actually it's not the same as you giving birth to your child and you deciding how to parent that child and putting in the structures. And yes, you might make some mistakes and you learn as you go, but actually what you have is you're getting a child who is already coming with their own trauma and experience and their own understanding then of what parenting is and isn't, and then you're trying to correct it somehow or make up for it or do it differently. And it's yeah, there's no guide to being a parent, but there's even less of a guide to being a kinship carer, and then being a kinship carer who's also a sibling, who
So
has had,
experience of the care system themselves. It's like
yeah,
how to make this cake of support just as messy and with so many ingredients for you to try and figure out with the least amount of support, it feels like then.
yeah. And I think like there are like kind of cross-cutting assumptions at each stage, which make it a real barrier for sibling kinship carers. I
Mm.
think kinship care in and of itself is very misunderstood and not really known about. Like kinship care is not a term that most people, in the general population know,
Yeah.
and it doesn't really resonate with people that much. And like, people know about foster care. Like there are foster care narratives all around. People know what it is. People know about adoption, but like kinship care is quite hidden. Actually, if you speak to people about it, everyone's like, "Oh yeah, of course. Like my dad was actually brought up by his auntie," or
Well, is it a generational thing of actually, previous to our parents' generation, it happened a lot, where
well,
there was a lot of kinship care. It just wasn't named that.
yeah, and I don't think it's generational. I think it still happens a lot. Like, um, it like globally, it's just the normal way that you look after family when parents can't, you know? Like, what would you do? Like, if you like anyone, even people who haven't had experience with the care system, like I often say to them, well, you know, if you have a, if you have a sister and she gets ill and she has to go into hospital and she's got kids, what do you do? Like you step in and the kids come and stay with you. Like that's just the normal way of doing things, right? Like if your, you know, best friend dies in a sudden car crash, and like there's no one to care for her children, like, most people would understand that like actually the normal thing to do would be that someone within that network would step up and try and support those children. Like that is a very common, it's just globally like a common thing to do to respond to crisis in families. But, it's not called, people don't have a word for it because it doesn't fit within that like normative nuclear family structure.
I,
It's just, yeah.
I was just thinking there because you said within the network, and then I was thinking about obviously the experiences of if you are a sibling um, care experience, kinship carer, that network isn't there.
Yeah. And I think that's what I mean by these like cross-cutting barriers. So like kinship care is kind of hidden and not really known about or supported. And then being care experienced, is kind of hidden and there's a lot of stigma around it. And also it causes its own trauma and barriers, like being taken into the care system like breaks your networks. And like young people talk about how they'll grow up without ever really having a relationship with anyone who isn't paid to have a relationship with them, her social worker or a foster carer, like, and then so you've got that, barrier and experience that's again like quite hidden because foster care is known about, but being care experienced and the actual, consequences of that is quite hidden societally, and then on top of that, you've got like a really complicated experience of siblinghood. Like, there's a lot of people and a lot of the narratives around having a brother or sister is like, oh, yeah, like, which one's the funny one? Which one's the smart one? Like, you go on family holidays, like, the jokes about, are you like, who's your mum's favorite? Or, you know, um, are you the oldest or the youngest? But when you're a care experience, like, all of that siblinghood stuff is like really messy. Like often young people, like kids aren't put together in the same foster home, or, one might be at home and one might be in foster care. You might go through lots of foster homes. And so then you're sometimes the oldest child, sometimes the youngest child, sometimes the middle child. You don't get to build normal experiences with your siblings, like going on holiday together or having dinner together in the way that like other siblings create those bonds. So then I think a lot of siblings get the chance to, sometimes they don't even like each other, but there's enough shared experience that like that bond is really strong,
Mm.
even without, it being smooth or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas I think when you're care experience, like a lot of the time, your experience of siblinghood is just not like what people think
Yeah.
being a sibling is. So you've got kind of kinship care, which is not how people think families are. And then you've got being care experience, which is not what people think kind of, young people are in terms of their networks and their experience of having a family. And then you've got siblinghood, which is also, for us very different from what people assume siblinghood is like. And then you bring all three of those together and you just get this kind of really complicated mess that no one really understands or thinks about when they think about any of these things like kinship care or care experience or siblinghood.
And I guess thinking about that kind of unseen landscape, I guess, and within those roles of then having, what does it mean to actually then transfer into being a parent or in the parental
Mhm.
role of a sibling if, as you say, we've got all of these additional barriers and boundaries to start with.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's difficult because there's also like just, I was 22 when I became a kinship carer. Like there are also just a lot of societal stigmas and barriers around being a young person,
Mm.
So in my PhD research, I so I spoke to carers and young people and I developed these kind of narrative vignettes, which were kind of anonymous, but they were kind of combinations of different stories. So it gave like a kind of typical story. And I presented those to teams of kind of social work practitioners who worked with kinship carers and kind of talked through then kind of what they think some of the challenges might have been for that carer, like how as a team they might support that carer, what they think they might need. And it was really interesting because in one of my focus groups, well, generally in all of them, they were like, oh, yeah, I've never even thought about this before. Um, but in one of them, this practitioner, who was a senior practitioner, she was very lovely, but she said, oh, I've never really considered siblings as potential kinship carers. She was like, well, like my 25-year-old, I wouldn't trust him with a bag of crisps. Um, never mind to look after a child. you know, and then within that focus group, like, she was kind of challenged a little bit because, then someone was like, yeah, but that's probably not fair on all young people. And then this, practitioner was like, yeah, I shouldn't be bringing that lens, into my work. And, so even just like hearing someone else's story, or like that
Highlighted
some
that
siblings
bias.
are kinship carers, yeah, just completely like highlighted to her, like, oh my God, I've been completely discounting all young people because I'm seeing it through the lens of my 25-year-old son who obviously doesn't have any caring responsibilities. So she's not able to see him as a potential carer because she doesn't have to, which is fine. But she shouldn't make that assumption for all young
No.
people.
And that kind of like links into like a completely different discussion around, oh, this practitioner is not expecting a 25-year-old to have any responsibilities, but yet we throw all of these responsibilities of onto children in care at 16 and 18. But that is a different podcast and we won't go down that rabbit hole, although we probably could do. Um, so yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Is that those concepts and they just miss the point completely.
Yeah, and I think so you do get some practitioners who do get it. So like, I was talking to one practitioner who kind of worked for a charity, and she, that charity like does a lot of support for kinship carers. And she'd had a couple of kinship carers who were siblings, not many, but she was, very much like really reflective and trying to think about, well, what would be different for a sibling carer compared to others. And she recognized that coming to a support group might be really weird for a sibling because you're going to be the youngest one there. Your experience is going to be very different. So, she'd gone out of her way to kind of identify another sibling kinship carer and try and pair the two together so they could come, along to a support group at the same time. She was thinking about, she had an 18-year-old and she was like, okay, we need to think differently about what support looks like for sibling kinship carers. So she was like, well, why can't we say we would fund festival tickets for, a young kinship carer to kind of go to a festival and get a bit of a break? Why shouldn't that be how we think about respite care, for young people rather than, it being, that a kid goes off to a, foster care somewhere, so the kinship carer gets a break. Like, and she was very reflective and being like, uh, everything we've got on offer is framed from the perspective of like an older person. So we need to think differently about kind of, well, what is it that young people might find helpful and supportive kind of navigating this space rather than just always having to fit young people into very adult focused services, right?
Yeah, and I feel like when we think about, I guess, those experiences as a sibling kinship carer, like definitely, I don't like there was on top of that, I think there's a main difference I'm thinking about is that because we're at such a young age, we're actually putting aside a lot of our own, I guess, wishes and dreams a lot of the time to make space to care for a sibling and to make sure that to try and lessen, I guess, that trauma that they might experience otherwise. And there's a complexity to that of kind of having a loyalty to our siblings and, wanting the best for them. There's grief in having to step away from your own dreams and your own wants in that time. And also guilt about not being able to do what we can do the best of and not doing it right all the time because we haven't had that experience either with so little support.
Yeah, I think there's also, I had some people who, like, kind of talking about being trauma informed. I had like a lot more people get in touch to take a part in the research in my PhD than actually did because some people, I always had like a pre-conversation with people before they took part to kind of talk through, this is what we'll talk about, this is how it'll look. And actually in some of those pre-conversations, like it was very clear to me and became clear to the people who want to take part that they weren't necessarily ready to talk about that experience because it felt so raw and like those emotions, those feelings of guilt and of yeah, I remember one person who kind of, who I spoke to who didn't end up taking part, actually she just wanted to talk to me. Like she just wanted to talk to someone who had that same experience, right? Not as a research participant, just as a human. And basically what she wanted to talk about was like she just asked me like, is it normal to feel really angry? To feel really like sad and angry and frustrated that I have to do this and I don't want to and it's not fair. And like, she was talking about she was at a stage where she'd supported her younger brother, who'd like brought him up, and then he'd gone off to university, and she was like, now kind of about to turn 30, and she wanted to go to university, but she'd had to take on another younger sibling.
Mm.
Um, and, she was like, I thought I was going to get my time, and then I've had to put that off again. And, I'm stuck in this cycle. And it was so sad because, like I very much, it just wasn't right for
Yeah.
her to take part in the research at that time, but I did stay in touch with her a bit afterwards. But she just wanted some validation that like it's okay to feel like this is really shit. Like it's not fair. It's absolutely not fair that you have not made a choice to have children, but you are here having to bring up these children and put aside what you wanted from your life and see them hopefully go off and thrive or whatever while you take a back seat. And I think there is also like a real gendered lens to that. There's like, as the girl, the oldest girl, like it's kind of your role a little bit.
Yeah, and I think there's then that duality, isn't there, of there's a lot of pain in that, but also pride because she's taking care of a sibling who's then gone on to university, and we want the best for our siblings, and that's why we do this. But there's so much pain involved in that too, of having to
Yeah.
take a step back.
Yeah. And I do think that it's like, I think sometimes the way like narratives are presented, so of kinship care or of kind of being care experience, like it's always binary. Like it was either all good or all bad. Whereas the reality is, there are some good things and some bad things, and that's what we navigate. But I think as humans, we're much more likely to fixate on the things that didn't go well.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's why I really like the narrative approach in research as well, because it helps people think through like their own story and their own experiences in a way that they don't always get a chance to do. So one thing that was really interesting when I spoke to carers and also kind of young people who'd been brought up by their siblings, often well, interestingly enough, nearly everyone apologized to me for not remembering things in a really clear, neat way.
Mhm.
And so a lot of people were like, oh, I'm not remembering the exact dates or the exact order. And I think that's really interesting because we don't, I think it particularly being care experience, but experience and trauma as well. Like quite often your narratives are interrupted or, they are messy and it's quite hard to put things together into uh like a timeline. Like a lot of people who've had a very, you know, quote unquote normal life where they've lived in the same kind of house and the same kind of family,
Yeah.
like they can remember, okay, on my eighth birthday, this is what I did. And then we went on holiday at this point. Whereas I think when your story doesn't align with that, like you've been to different schools, lived in different houses, like
Mm.
had all these different experiences, then it isn't neat. But I think doing the narrative interviews, it helped a lot of people. Like a lot of the carers that I spoke to at the end would say, "Oh, yeah, shit, that was a lot." And like I didn't realize beforehand that like, oh my God, I was 11 when that was happening. Of course, like no wonder I like feel like that. Or oh my God, I was trying to finish university at the same time as taking on, caring for my younger sibling, and at the same time as going through a relationship breakdown, and at the same time as trying to work two jobs to be able to afford my bills. But like often people don't get the chance to like really reflect and be like, oh, it's no wonder I didn't do the best job,
Mm.
at that point in time. I didn't like actually give my sibling the exact care I kind of wanted to at that time, or I made a bad decision about a relationship, or I didn't manage to get a job application in for like a really promising job at that point. And
Yeah.
it's only when you can look back and see almost like that in a linear way that's when you can reflect and say, and be a bit kinder to yourself about the things that, didn't go quite so well. But I think without having the opportunity to sit and think through that in a really structured way, a lot of people end up kind of just ruminating on oh my God, I can't believe I was so stupid to have not realized that that was happening at that time, or I can't believe I didn't do more at that point. Um, I
So
don't know. I think that's
like,
such a
yeah, it sounds
go on,
like
Carrie.
created and used, I presume, without maybe even realizing it, kind of trauma-informed ways of research in which you created such a safe space in which that
Mm.
connection and that trust could be built, that sharing those experiences wasn't a traumatizing experience to them. It wasn't vicariously traumatizing for you as a researcher.
Mm.
And also it provided healing at the end of it, which is astonishing that, I know that those experiences are not, lacking in trauma. Um,
Yeah.
so to be able to do that just sounds absolutely incredible.
Yeah. I think it was like I just think it's so rare for because there's such a drive in research, I think, to want to quantify and generalize everything, want to, have you managed to speak to 50 people, or have you ensured that like your sample is diverse enough, or you've also done like a survey or whatever. There's like not often the opportunity to just sit with people for as long as they want to talk, give them the structure. So in my interviews, I gave people like a little task beforehand that they didn't have to do, but it was like, you could think about your life like in 5 chapters. Who would be the main characters in each chapter? What are the key events? So it gives people a bit of a framework for being able to talk through, their experiences, but also think about what they want to say. Um, and I think so often I've taken part in lots of research, but I've done lots of research and I've read lots of research. And so often you don't. So one of the things that I really like in my research interviews is sometimes people they started with their grandparents as children, you know? They were like, in order for you to understand my experience and my experience with my siblings, you've got to understand like what happened to my grandma, you know? Um, and if you understand that, then you can kind of understand what happened to my mum. And
Yeah.
then you can understand who my mum was. And then you can understand my childhood and how I became who I am. And only then can you start to understand like how we are in this situation as siblings.
Yeah.
But so often research doesn't give people the opportunity to start where they want to start. They ask like you go straight in with like, tell me about this specific thing. And I thought like having that really open approach to the research, like it led it in different directions.
Yeah.
Um,
So what you
yeah.
did was to meet them with curiosity.
Hmm.
I think what you're saying, what I'm hearing, I guess, is that there's a great power in that curiosity. And I wonder then what it would mean if actually the professionals supporting kinship carers also met kinship carers with curiosity instead of that compliance of this is what we need to know.
Yeah. And I think because kinship care is so complicated, and a lot of the research, right, that I talked about, that I read beforehand about kinship care, they just asked about what's your experience of being a kinship carer? What's hard? What could you do with more support? But a lot of it didn't like roll back and say, well, how did you end up as a family kind of being in a kinship care arrangement? Like, what is it like intergenerationally?
Yeah.
That has led us to this place. And often the questions on like a kinship care assessment are, actually some of them will ask like, what was your experience of parenting? How does that, potentially affect you as a parent, as a potential kinship carer? So they will ask those questions, but when you're being assessed on that, it's very different, right?
Clinical.
You know?
Also, you might not know what it's going to be either. Like,
Yeah.
especially for siblings who haven't had children, how are we going to know how our parenting is going to be? We have a concept, an idea of what that might be, but we don't know really.
Yeah.
We write down what we hope it's going to be and what we
Yeah.
help on, but actually, in reality, what does that even mean?
Yeah. And I think like creating more spaces for curiosity, but also like I guess like a bit of playfulness as well, I think could work really nicely in that space with practitioners, like actually being able to like role play a little bit. You know, you can imagine it would be like super helpful to have someone who has that experience of understanding, you know, how trauma might manifest in different behaviors, like who might
Very useful, not
understand.
just maybe useful, definitely very useful.
Yeah, but like also, you know, might have had that experience of working with lots of different kinship carers and all that kind of stuff, and being able to sit with you as a young carer to say, okay, well, let's play it out, right? You're looking after your brother and like he decides he doesn't want to go to school anymore. Like, how would you have that conversation? Let's think about modeling it. Like, how might it work? What would you do? How do you think it might work if you said this as opposed to this? Or what reaction do you think you would get if you did this? Why do you think you might get that reaction? Where do you think it's coming from? Like, I think those things would be so useful because I just found myself like, and you know, so many of my participants in my research was just like, you're just winging it. Like, you don't know. And then some things work, some things don't. But like, actually, like, you don't have you just go and trying to do the best you can, but with no real structure, support, framework, or like chance to reflect and say, well, that went terribly. Why did that go terribly?
And I guess it's having those safe spaces to do that as well. And
Yeah,
you know, you mentioned about someone that you spoke to that didn't end up taking part of the research, and she just needed someone to speak to say, hey, is this normal?
yeah,
And I guess then there's strength in that community, I guess, you know, because
yeah,
it isn't a big community, but actually who's tried to build that community previous to the work that
100%.
you've done.
Yeah. I think it's so important to have the space to talk to people who get it, you know, like actually just me and you being able to talk.
Yeah.
And we have that starting point of like knowing that, you know, obviously we've had different experiences, but like we know how hard it can be. We know like how frustrating it can be, how sad, how joyful, but also just like that that it's an experience that happens, right? Like even just a starting point of you understanding that sibling kinship care is a thing
Yeah.
because you've done it, like is a
And you're
different
not the
starting
only.
point from exactly, it's a different starting point from most conversations I would have with most people, like, you know,
Mm.
in the world who would never have even considered that that's a thing that might happen. Like it changes, yeah, it just changes the conversation. It's the same with being care experienced, right? Like when you know you're talking to someone else who's care experienced, it like lowers the barriers so quickly because you get that you're going to have a base level of understanding with each other that that kind of skips some of the other stuff that you might have to go through with other people. Because if you tell other people that you grew up in foster care and they have no personal experience, then you have the, oh, that's so sad. That must have been so difficult. I can't even imagine. And then, you know, the people who are like, you know, but
But go
you,
on.
yeah, but you're obviously one of the ones that it worked really well for.
You
You're
did
one of
really
the
well.
success stories.
You're so successful.
Yeah. And then you're like, ah, whereas if I speak to someone else who's care experienced, you know, the fact that I've got a PhD is kind of neither here nor there, right? It's like, it's the, okay, you talk to someone else who's care experienced and they know you've got a PhD and they're like, I can imagine that was a really hard journey
Yeah,
getting there because of all of that. And like there's just that recognition of that experience straight away. You know, it's not the same as, you know, you don't get the, oh my God, you're so amazing. You get the, oh yeah,
you've
good for
worked.
you.
Yeah, and there's healing in that, isn't there? There's healing,
100%.
absolutely, and yeah, there's definitely healing to be able to see and to hear those stories. And I guess it, now I'm thinking, so I'm like, okay, because this has become a running theme in these podcasts where you know we're highlighting without really you know alluding to that. Every person has brought up the fact that actually there is strength and really big strength in being able to have access to a community and have access to a community that isn't traumatizing. So the access is not just here's access to every single care experience person and actually that might be really trauma inducing. And, God forbid, I've definitely been in those experiences where I have been within groups of my peers and it has been trauma inducing and re-traumatizing. But how do we, I guess, is it our job to try and create those communities? Is it the structures and support systems that need to do more of a job? And maybe, I don't know, we might not even have the answer. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because I think when it works well, it's often because it kind of happens naturally.
Mm.
Like there were definitely times in my life where I would not, in fact, I did not kind of engage with a kind of care experience community.
Yeah.
And I kind of found it, I think because inherently, like a lot of people who've kind of been through the care system, like are quite caring and
Mm.
quite empathetic to other people's trauma and difficulties. So like you will end up jumping in and trying to help kind of,
A
more
class
so than a
people pleaser.
people pleasing, yes, but also I think you know how bad it can get, so you want to help
Yeah.
and you recognize that like actually, this person who needs that help probably doesn't have anyone else.
Mm.
And I do think I definitely found myself like when I was younger, oh, I don't know, like anyone could live it, random people living in my house because they didn't have anywhere else to go and feeding everyone who I could, Carrie, I'm very sure you'd be exactly the same. And I've met so many other care experienced people who are very much like just trying to help as many people as possible because they recognize like that help and support is missing so often. So for me, I think being in a space with a lot of other care experienced people, I just knew I would end up mothering a lot of people and like trying to support too many people. And like at a certain point in my life, I just wasn't able to do that.
You just didn't have the capacity.
Um,
You had to look after
yeah,
yourself. Yeah.
exactly. But I also think there's like a lot of, like people talk about internalized misogyny, right? So like, women who have kind of absorbed ideas about what women are like, kind
Yeah.
of internally, and then they think, oh, women aren't as funny as men or whatever. Like I think like there's quite a lot of internalized, I don't know, like stigma and assumptions about other care experienced people as well sometimes. Like I think I don't know, like growing up, I was in foster homes and we had lots of young people would come and go and I would come and go and all this kind of stuff. And like everyone was often struggling and traumatized and behaving in certain ways and whatever. And I think there was part of me that was like, I need to protect myself against all of this if I'm gonna be able to get myself out. Like I
Yeah.
can't be around people who are in these kind of cycles of continuous trauma because
I
I
mean,
will also,
and that's actually really trauma aware because you're saying I am being impacted by vicarious trauma right now, and actually
yeah,
I need to be out of that environment. So actually, that shows a really high awareness without having, I
mhm,
guess, those professional words of trauma informed and all of that kind of stuff.
yeah,
Very much felt that actually, and when we're talking about working in a trauma informed way, we really do like to say actually it's how you feel. It's not the words that we're using, it's how you're feeling in that situation.
yeah,
And if that situation is making you feel shaky and re-traumatized, then absolutely
yeah.
that's not the space for you to be in that point.
But I think it's so interesting though, because I think, well, okay, two things. So, one, I think that's why I really like the kind of care experienced academics
Yeah.
group, that because actually, yeah, everyone's care experienced, but also everyone has gone on a kind of journey through education
Oh,
that is,
they're so all over, aren't they? I love it.
yeah, and it and like so it's not just the care experience that's the commonality, it's also the kind of journey through education and academia, which I have in common with people. So I'm like, actually, I know we can support each other through this other really complicated thing.
Yeah.
And I really like that. But I guess the other thing, coming back to what we were talking about sibling kinship care, is actually taking on the care of your siblings is a little bit like also that vicarious trauma, but you can't get away from it, right? So like, for me, I'd kind of managed to kind of, I moved out at 16, I got a job, I managed to get myself through college, I'd gone off to university,
Mm.
and then I had to come back and look after my brother. And I had to like actually come back, back to my home area, back to a really, really rough council estate, back to that kind of life and experience of living alongside, people who are, taking drugs and all this kind of stuff, and to look after a child who was a traumatized care experiencing person, right? And, with all of his friends and all that kind of community that was around him. And like, I knew for myself that like putting myself back in that environment was not going to be good for me, but
Mm.
you kind of have to because it's your sibling, right? And I think there's no protection for care experienced people who then become carers for others.
Mm.
Um, and it doesn't have to just be sibling kinship carers, right? Like I know so many care experienced people who leave the system, try to make a better life for themselves, and then end up having to care for their parents, right? Or end up having to care for other people within their network. And those people haven't had, the support, they haven't had the time to recover. And then, you get kind of dragged back into that life and that cycle and that experience. And it's really hard to kind of at some point say, no, this is not what I want for my life. I want to be able to go and build a life that I want for myself. And I can't always do that around
Yeah.
people who haven't been able to break that cycle.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And like literally last week I had a very similar experience where, a foster sibling is really struggling at the moment and mentally. And, me and one of my other siblings were trying really hard to get them the mental health support that they got. And literally just a week back in that family dynamic was trauma inducing. Like I felt exhausted. I had like just my head hurt all the time. I was so fatigued, and I was like, "Oh, I need to step out. This is not okay. Like I have just been drenched." And I was reading, the group chat I was trying to organize stuff, and I was like, "This is just drenched in trauma." And actually,
Mm.
I've done what I can. Like, and actually, this is time for me to step back out.
Yeah,
um, because this is actually dangerous for me to be back in here, and
yeah,
me on a whole rabbit hole of getting out my care records. I was like, why am I doing this to myself? Like, I don't need to be reminded of all of this. Like, I've done a lot of healing,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah. I think it's so interesting because I think like that's such a big part of kinship care that is not recognized. Like that, um, whether it's sibling kinship carers or just other kinship carers, like often the person who becomes the kinship carer is the one who's managed to hold things together, right? Despite being in difficult circumstances themselves. So, often grandparents who become kinship carers, like they've had their own trauma, whether it's like earlier on in their lives or in the relationship with the parent of the child, but they're often the ones in the family that are like, okay, they've managed to just about cobble
Yeah.
some level of normal life for themselves. And then by becoming a kinship carer, it reopens all of those relationships that maybe were quite damaging, all of those memories, all of those experiences. And that's the bit that like kinship carers like definitely get no support with. They're just expected to manage that, like because it's once you become a kinship carer, it's all about the child, which is totally understandable. But actually, some kinship carers, they're expected to like, facilitate that child, having a relationship with the dad who was physically violent towards, their own daughter or, was physically, who's abusive to them. Like I spoke to one again, sibling kinship carer who, had been, physically attacked by the father of her sibling that she was looking after. She'd had the police called on her, like saying that she was trying to kidnap this child and whatever. And, she's just trying to raise her brother and care for him. But at the same time, getting all of this kind of abuse and there's just so little, you're just expected to deal with it because you have to protect the child, right? There's nothing about actually how do you protect yourself and how do you sometimes take a step back when you have to, like, and not feel guilty.
Yeah, it's taken me a long time to step away from that guilt. And I can remember actually, I think 3 years in, 4 years in maybe to my kinship experience, where things had got really, really hard. And it was the first person ever asked me, how am I doing? And I just cried because
Mm,
nobody asked how I was doing in all of that. And there's
yeah.
something missing there in those structures, isn't there? around if we're wanting these people who are caring and want to help heal and want to help support, there needs to be the support systems in place to support them, because otherwise we're just creating more harm and,
Yeah.
you know, essentially punishing and damaging the people who are stepping out and saying, hey, I'm going to help right now, regardless
Yeah.
of what it creates for my life. I'm stepping up and I'm taking this on.
Yeah.
So I guess
Yeah.
if we're then thinking about how do we make kinship care better, what would it look like, if we designed that kinship care support and healing with that in the center of it all, at its heart, what would that then look?
Yeah. I think I think the starting point is to not expect kinship care to look like any other type of care or family. Like, I think that one of the huge problems is like the systems are designed for foster care, right? They're designed for, a child to be kind of taken and put with a stranger, right? And for that stranger to be someone who's trained and ready, who has a house, who has made a decision
Has
to
stability,
become a foster carer.
possibly.
Yeah, yeah. Has, often had their life experience the way they wanted it and now want to give back in some kind of way or whatever, but also can stop whenever they want
Oh
and
yeah.
do, you know, you know, so many foster
It's
carers
job,
are like, oh,
actually.
yeah, this child's too difficult, I'm tapping out.
Yeah.
Like that's just not the same in kinship care. Like, there's like the research says there's more what they call it placement stability in kinship care. And like that's a good thing because children don't have as many moves and whatever. But actually, so much of that is driven by kinship carers who are really, really struggling,
And
you
really
know,
stubborn
yeah,
to the
struggling. They're
loyalty, stubborn to the loyalty of support.
stubborn, but not, it's not just stubborn, it's that the alternative is like, if I don't keep going, this child is going to go to a stranger and have a worse,
I meant to
experience with
say in
someone
a
who
good
doesn't,
way. Exactly. Stubborn as if saying, I'm not giving up, I'm not giving up, then they're still
yeah,
giving up, even to the detriment if it's really damaging to them.
yeah. And to the child sometimes, actually, because if the carer is struggling that much and that traumatized, like, and not getting the support, they're probably not being the best carer, or the carer that that child needs at that point. So I think there's something about recognizing that, like, I think one of the problems is that a lot of people become kinship carers or continue to be kinship carers because there's no good alternative. There are no options. It's like that or nothing. Like either you're a kinship carer for this child or this child is gone, and they're gonna be in the system. You might not see them. I wish there were more models that kind of recognize like types of shared care. So
Mhm.
where you might have, so there's like a model called like step up, step down foster caring, which is where a foster carer will kind of work with, when a child's going back home, will kind of foster the family a little bit. So we'll kind of support the parents and the child in that reunification process. And the child can sometimes stay with the foster carer, sometimes be at home with their parents, and there's that fluidity. And the foster carer is kind of really supporting kind of that parent to kind of step back into that role and give them the support. But like I could imagine, like for kinship care, like actually if you could have a model where, the child's not necessarily 100% of the time in kinship care, like maybe there's a wraparound support. There's like a linked foster carer, foster family who, between the two of you, you're meeting that child's needs and making sure they're cared for. But like you still have a really active role in caring for that child. It might be that you have your sibling at the weekends and they're with a foster carer during the week, but then they can come back and forwards between the foster carer's house and your house. It's not binary. It's not like a one size fits all.
Which I think the system is very much built around, isn't it? This is
Mm.
the expectations that we have. You meet this criteria. If you don't meet this criteria, then you fall outside of that box and
Yeah.
kind of
If
stuff.
you can't, yeah, if you can't do it all, you can't do any of it. You know, it's like you're either the carer for this child or you're nothing.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's so hard because that's what I think makes a lot of carers stick with it until it is, such a crisis situation that it breaks down really badly. And often at that point, it breaks the relationship between the child and the person who probably cares the most about them, because things have got so bad. So I just think like just having more creative, kinship focused ways of supporting families
Mm.
would 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 be transformative. And I do think like, a lot of kinship carers, not just siblings, will say that, the reason they became a kinship carer was because they didn't think they had a choice, you
Mm.
know, because the alternative was just so horrible, right? The alternative was, well, this child is going to go into care and you have no control over where they'll be, what foster carers they'll be with, like what their experience will be. We might arrange contact, at some point, but you're not going to know what that's going to look like.
I mean, the language itself is just, it's not humanizing. It's not,
Yeah,
doesn't give a sense of belonging and all of that at all.
yeah,
And I wondered just in terms of other aspects, something that we haven't talked about yet is around, I guess, the financial support that doesn't come with, I guess,
yeah,
kinship differences too.
yeah.
Is
And
that?
I think I just realized that obviously we're doing an audio medium. I know we're videoing it as well, but not everyone will see my quote, my finger quotes when I say words like contact and placement stability. But I hate that language, which is why I'm always like air quotes when I
Yeah.
say it. But it's the system language that's used that completely it's just not family. It's not how we would speak. It's no one would, say, oh, right, I'm just going to have contact with my dad later. Like, no, what?
Just
Like,
gonna have some
so
family
weird.
contact with my auntie this weekend.
Yeah, I'm just having contact with my husband at the cinema. What? It's so weird.
Strange assessment.
Yeah, but yes, so I just want to put on the record that I very much think
Lots
this
of hair
language
growth.
is
Sorry, yeah.
is absolute nonsense. But yeah, I think in terms of like the financial stuff, it's so complicated. So there's like in England, especially at the minute, there's such a focus on kinship care, which is great. Because I mean, when I started this kind of research like 5, 6 years ago, there really wasn't any focus on kinship care. Um, but a lot of it, I think, is about, well, on one hand, people say, oh, kinship care because it's better for children. But the reality is kinship care because it's cheaper.
Mm.
Like, so even for, the most supported kinship carers like I was, so like kinship foster carers, you get a financial allowance, which is meant to meet the needs of that child. But it's basically everywhere like lower than what foster carers, like mainstream foster carers get. Not because they give kinship carers, like so often like the kinship carer and the foster carer will get the same minimum payment, but then like foster carers get additional payments. So if they have, more than one child, if they have, they'll have like specialty foster carer payments where, they get an enhanced allowance because that child's got additional needs or is particularly challenging or whatever. In some local authorities, now foster carers who have a professional background get an enhanced fostering allowance. So, if you're a teacher and you become a foster carer, you get a higher rate than if you weren't a teacher or if you've done certain training programs. Whereas kinship carers get the basic allowance.
Yeah.
And honestly, I can't remember what it was I got, but it was like,
I think I
I
remember
mean,
because you told me. I think you said it was
yeah,
£100 a week or something like that.
yeah. It was like so, I mean, my brother was a teenage boy, like, I mean, it barely covered the food. Never mind the bus pass, the he's gone off somewhere, fallen asleep on the bus and needs a taxi back because he doesn't know where he is. The he punched a hole in the wall and I need to try and get it fixed. That stuff, doesn't cover that. And it doesn't cover you know, he doesn't want the cheapest brand of trainers from Tesco that I could get. He would want the Adidas trainers. Obviously, like the allowance was like it. It was so stupidly low. But on the one hand, I got something, which a lot of people don't.
Yeah,
But
I
it,
do.
it,
I think I got
yeah,
child benefit, and then right at the end, um, after he'd moved out, I learned that I could have applied for guardianship allowance. And they were like, yeah, we're not going to backdate that. And I was like, literally, you would have owed me about 4 or 5 grand at this point, and that
Yeah.
wasn't even a lot of money anyway. Like, it
Yeah.
made such a difference. And you were just saying there about the amount, and I guess that conversation around finance as well. I don't think there's any kind of scoping of what your income is
Yeah.
anyway, to be able to have you actually got enough money to support yourself anyway, and then we're giving
Yeah.
this additional need and then saying this is enough to do that.
I think as well, like it was almost like the money caused more problems that it solved because it wasn't enough, but also it made, when you've been in care and your foster care is being paid to
Yeah.
look after you, like it creates a certain dynamic within the relationship. So then if you bring that into kinship care and being siblings, like my brother definitely like had times where he was like, oh, you're just doing this for the money. And I'm like, I'm like, that is laughable. Like, it was literally like, I was living in London. I just finished my degree. I got a first class degree. I'd been offered a job, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, I'm doing this for the £100 a week to live in like a dodgy council estate up north with a like, oh yeah. It's not like I haven't spent all of my savings and I'm in debt now. But like, it creates a dynamic within the relationship for kids, especially who have been raised by people who are paid to raise them. And, he came from having been in a foster family where, they had a very nice, detached house and 2 cars and all this kind of stuff. And like he knew a lot of that money came from them being foster carers, right? But I'm like,
If you
that's
had
not,
income, maybe.
yeah, we definitely did not get the same allowance. And I was very open about like, this is the amount. This is what, we'd go and do the food shopping together and stuff like that. But, for a kid, they don't know that £100 isn't a huge amount of money, right?
Yeah.
Um, but then you've got like so many carers who don't even get that, right? Don't even get the basics. But also, I remember interviewing people during my PhD who, unlike you, knew they were entitled to some allowance, but they were too scared to ask for it because they were worried that services would say, "Oh, well, if you're only, if you can't afford to look after your brother, then you shouldn't have them," or make them aware of situations that they weren't aware of, or that there would be kind of some assumption that they were only doing it like for money, right?
Yeah.
And so there were some people who they were waiting for an allowance that they were told they were going to get and they never got it, and they didn't want to complain because they were worried that that would put them in a vulnerable position. Like it's not good enough just to say, oh, you could give someone 100 quid a week, they'll then be fine. Like,
Properly thinking about, the actual needs of that family and allocating it properly. And I think, we've probably been going almost an hour, if not longer now. So I know we could obviously keep talking and talking and talking, but we do have to like pull it in. We need to pull it in, guys. So I'm gonna try and close us on a couple of key questions. Okay.
yeah,
So a nice, lovely one. What gives you hope for future kinship families and the young people that they raise?
I think there is much more awareness now of the reality of kinship care, um, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that kinship care needs to be thought of as just a normal family type in its own right, not an alternative to foster care. Um, and I just think that's been raised by so many people in so many corners. So yeah, that definitely gives me hope.
Yeah. And I think maybe a change in which we don't just see sibling carers as the exceptions, but actually they're experts in that care and connection. They are probably some of the closest people, to that child.
100%.
If supported properly, can give some of the best experiences.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, beyond kinship care, also, I mean, I don't think it doesn't feel hopeful for me at the minute, but I would really hope to see more just appreciation and protection of sibling relationships
Yeah.
throughout the care system and kind of social work involvement. And I don't see that changing at the minute. I think that's, another whole area. But I think just recognizing how important siblings are, um, would be a really good place to start with some of this work.
Absolutely. And is there anything that you would like to share with our fabulous audience that listens to us that we haven't discussed today, that you'd like them to know?
Well, I think we have discussed it, but I guess just to like underline the point that so many care experienced people that I know and I've met, and so many kinship carers they give so much of themselves to other people. You know, they're so caring and so ready to step up and do what needs to be done, despite having, you know, their own challenges and traumas and, you know, gaps in having their own needs met. They are willing to kind of put themselves out there on the line and help in a way that, you know, I don't see so widely in society. And I think that is one of the narratives that is really missing from this kind of, you know, hero to zero kind of binary narrative that you hear about care experiencing people. You know, the focus is always on, oh wow, that one care experienced person who went to university or became a celebrity, or that care experienced person that became a serial killer or whatever in whatever BBC drama there is. But there's very little focus on like just that everyday care that care experienced people kind of show to other people within the community, the care experienced community, but just more widely. They're, you know, often the ones that are stepping up.
So I guess kind of reflecting on that, you know, those with care experience and kinship care is kind of a really a beautiful story of love. That shouldn't be lived in isolation. We need that community around us, and that there's a real strength when we listen to those people that are holding those families together. And it's with sharing those experiences that actually we can really truly start to understand actually what true care looks like and how it can help heal.
Yeah, I think in the kinship kind of assessment world, often being care experienced or having experienced trauma or having experienced patchy parenting yourself is seen as a weakness that needs to be overcome or mitigated in some way, as opposed to a strength, you know, as opposed to kind of recognizing that, you know, when you haven't had the best experience, you want to help other people have a better experience and help other people thrive. And I see that so much with the sibling kinship carers that I spoke to in my research. Like, but yeah, I think that's really hopeful and also just really under recognized.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk forever, Carrie. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us. To learn more, visit the Trauma Informed Consultancy Services website. We'll see you next time.